Alright, stream is up. We'll be starting in a minute, everyone. Just give some time for people to show up. And if you can, let me know that all the audio and video is working properly by letting me know in the chat. Let's check OBS, making sure we're getting good sound. Good. Looks like. Hello, Piper. Thanks for letting me know that sounds good. We'll be starting in a minute. It's a little loud in my headphones, but I don't think it's that way because I have it set lower in the OBS. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the hopefully last stream for the SR71, because I think we only had one more thing to do, and that was to add the drag rotates to the switch guards in the cockpit. But before we do that, you know, last time we struggled in number 2, we struggled with some of the YokeManip instructions in the VR config file, and Joe had put out a tutorial video kind of describing that, and I kind of wanted to go over it, and I wanted to give you some additional examples and explain a little bit more about what you're actually doing in the VR config file as it relates to the instruction. So let's hop over to the SR71 joystick instruction, and if you remember, we were taking the joystick instruction, which is right here, the ATTR manip drag XY 4 arrows, and this is what we added when we moved the joystick into the cockpit OBJ, and then we added the manipulator and we added the drag XY manipulator. But drag XY manipulator is for two-dimensional operation. It's if you have the yoke on the screen, you can drag it with your mouse. The cursor changes the mouse to the 4 arrows cursor, and then by grabbing it you go up and down for pitch and left and right for the roll. And that's not good for VR, so in the VR config file we translate that into the VR controller. So in the instruction we added this manip instruction. So we tagged the manip, which is the drag XY, and we named the two data refs, which is the roll ratio and the pitch ratio that we're affecting, and then we had to add this YokeManip Rotate instruction, And this is where we got tripped up, because where are all these numbers coming from in this string? And really where they're coming from, if you want to do it without visualizing it, they're coming from these animations that precede it. And whenever you have an animation, you're going to have this sort of combination behind the manip. It's going to be a translate instruction, a rotate instruction, and a static translate instruction. Right? So we want to transfer the data from the translate here and the rotate here for the roll. And then if you back up even more, you're going to have the same thing for the pitch. You're going to have the rotate and the trans for the pitch. Now I know this is really tough to visualize in the Cockpit OBJ, but it's really easy to visualize in AC3D. So if I were to take this and I'm going to highlight on, see in this hierarchy here is the same hierarchy which we just saw in the Cockpit OBJ, and it's in the same order too. So if I click on the object, right, that is the object we're actually talking about. Then I have the rotate, which precedes it for the roll. And notice what highlights, it's this axis. And then I have the rotate that precedes it for the pitch, which is this axis. And if I were to show how it animates, let's say along the pitch, you have these sliders here, which you can access by going to animation time, X-plane animation time. And you can see that that whole assembly there is rotating about that highlighted axis in the pitch. And if I do the same thing with the rotate, it's also doing the same thing with the roll. See how it's rotating along that axis. And so what we're telling the YokeManip instruction, and we're taking it from the animation, is that there is a centroid point. That's the point at which the object sort of intersects with the axis, that where we want it to rotate against. And then we have the axis direction, which is either going to be in the X, Y, or Z direction, or some, if it's diagonal, it's going to be some combination of that. But it's basically a distance drawn in the axis. And then we have the angle definitions for what we want the rotation to look like. We have the angle definitions of how far we want it to rotate along that axis. Okay, so how does that translate into the YokeManip instruction? If I go to the VR config file, we start with, I believe, the pitch, I believe. Yeah, we start with the pitch. So the X, Y, and Z that we're putting in is the X, Y, and Z that where the object is intersecting with the axis, where along the axis, because we don't want to put the let's say if we use the centroid of the object, well, now that's where it's pivoting from, not the bottom of the object. So we want the bottom of the object, that's where the axis is actually located. And then in the next three lines, we're specifying that the axis is drawn in the X direction. So we just called it a length of 1. So this line here, in a sense, is being determined in space by that point, and at that point at the center, and then a distance in the X direction of 1. And that's our axis. And then lastly on the instruction, if I go back to it, this is the angle that we wanted to rotate. And then once we get done with the pitch, then we got to do the roll. It's the same thing. Now notice that in this particular case, the two axes intersect at that point, sort of in the center at the bottom of the joystick. So these 3 points, this X, Y, and Z, and this X, Y, and Z, are the same. What is the difference? Well, now I'm drawing that axis in the Z direction. So X, Y, and Z, that axis is now being drawn in the Z direction, which is this way. Okay? Because that's where I'm going to roll, the joystick between. Let me check to see if I have any comments. Nope, no comments. Okay, good. And then again, we had to define the angle that we wanted to rotate. Okay? So, but I want to stress here, we are not doing anything at all to the rotation itself or the animation itself of the object. What we are doing is we are manipulating the VR controller in the same space to intersect with that object so that it controls the same way as if your hand were really on it. So what we're really defining here is the VR controller in space. So let's say if I had this angle being half of what I'm currently showing it right now, and then I go and I rotate the object, right? Well, what that means is that if my angle in the YokeManip Rotate is only half of what the animation is actually doing, then that means that my VR controller is only going to be about halfway that distance when the animation is all the way to that distance, right? So it's going to show in the sim as if my controller is moving more slowly than the object when it rotates. So it's going to become it's going to look like it's coming away from the object as I rotate it. Conversely, if I make the angle in the YokeManip Rotate larger than the animation, then when I'm at full deflection, my VR controller is going to be off to the side. Let's say if I doubled the angle, I'm going to be at twice that rotationary distance with my VR controller than the object is. Okay? So this is why it's very important that we tune the VR controller to what's going on in the animation, because we always want those things to sync up, or at least we ideally want them to sync up. Now, there could be cases, why would you want it to be different? There could be cases, let's say if you're a particularly short-armed person, or if you have some kind of limitation in your VR controller that, for instance, you cannot actually extend, let's say, the joystick all the way out or all the way back. You can't, let's say you can't physically do that. Well, then you can adjust the angles for the pitch and for the roll to do what's comfortable, knowing that you're going to be moving at a different rate with your hand as the actual joystick. There's perhaps a reason for that. Now, in this particular example, and again, this is the YokeManip Rotate, which is explained in the VR config syntax. All right, that's this one right here. This is used when you have a pivot point of both the X and the Y direction, or both the pitch and the roll. And you have to define the centroid for each axis because they could be different. Now, in this particular case, we have the joystick, basically aligning at the bottom, so that centroid is the exact same spot for both axes. But you could have a situation where that's not the case. Now let's look at a situation where that's not the case. So I know this is a little bit far away. Let me see. This is for the 737 in the Laminar Research 737. Now in this particular case, the yoke is sitting on a pedestal. The pedestal rotates at a point on the floor of the cockpit, and then the yoke rotates at a point on the pedestal. So these two things are offset. So if you look at these two, if you look at these two rotates that are in, you have this first rotate here, and you have this rotate here. You can see the pitch is down here at the bottom, and I could slide that along that that axis. And again, it's where the point that you're using is the point at which you want the object to rotate against, when that would be right at the center point here on this axis where it's rotating about, or the bottom of the pedestal, in other words. And then we drew that in the X direction. All right. And then I go to the roll. And you can see now I have this axis here embedded within the animation. That's one of the reasons why the rotation is embedded, because that axis is actually going to rotate first along with the pitch. So if I you can see how the axis is also rotating, and that's because it's embedded in this tree of animation. So you have the pitch here, right? And then after the pitch you have the roll. And again, you're calling that in that point at which you want it to rotate against. So in this case, it's actually not the centroid of the object. It's a little bit above that. And then you have to define the angles by which it's going to rotate against in the same format that you did before. The only difference is going to be that the centroid for the pitch and the point for that, and the centroid for the roll here is going to be two different points in space. All right, and that's an offset situation. And now let's talk about another case which you are likely to come across, and that is the YokeManip Translate. And I'm going to use the example for the CB here. In this case, we don't have two rotates, right? We only have one rotate. What's going on here, if I were to, let's say, highlight on the object here, this is the my yoke that I have, which is, you see, it's in the animation, it's a little bit different. We have the animation is a rotate coupled with a translate only, right? It doesn't have a rotate here. It's just a translate only. What is a translate? Well, a translate will move the whole assembly in a specific direction. It doesn't have to be only in the Z direction, but in the case of this type of yoke, where we have the yoke going into the panel, straight into the panel in the Z direction. What's going on here is, you know, might seem obvious, but this is what we're doing. We're moving along that axis, right? And then we have the rotate, and we're defining the point in space that we're rotating against. That whole axis and object is moving along with this translate first, right? So if I move the whole thing, you can see that the axis, if you look at this right here, the axis is actually moving with the translate, right? That is because it's embedded in after this translate in this tree structure, okay? And then the rotate, if I do I'm still rotating about the point around the axis, okay? Now, luckily, as we're doing this, we do not have to actually define these points because they're already defined in the animation, and all we're doing is taking the information from the animation and translating it to the VR controller. So if I go back to the VR config file and I look at the YokeManip Translate, what I have is 3 sets of X, Y, and Z. So I have a minimum set of X, Y, and Z, a maximum set of X, Y, and Z, and then I have the centroid. So let's see, I have the X, Y, Z, the X, Y, Z, and then the roll centroid. Okay, so what that is doing is this minimum and maximum is giving me the points in space where the limits of that translate are. So if I look at it, there's the I believe that's the minimum, and there's the maximum. Does that make sense? So and we're only changing in the Z direction. All the others are the same. The X and Y are the same. We're not moving along any of the X and Y axis. We're not moving diagonally in space. We're just moving straight back and in. So the only one we change in the max and min are the Z axis, and we want to put the extremes of that translate. Now, that's already defined in the animation. So what are we doing in the VR config file? Whoops, sorry. Let me go back to the. When we put this in, what we're doing is we're defining the limits of the VR controller, and we're taking it from the animation. So if I were to take that Z min and Z max, let's say, and I put them inside of the animation. Let's say I make them half the distance of the animation. Then when I'm at the extreme from center, my VR controller is only going to be about halfway if I only use half the distance. Likewise, in the other direction, my VR controller would be halfway. And if I do that in this case, the animation will sort of be faster than my VR controller movement, and the animation would actually swallow up my VR controller in this case if I'm moving it towards me. Conversely, if I make the distance more than the animation, then I'm going to be the animation is going to be moving slower than the VR controller, and as I push the VR controller, I will be well past, let's say at the extreme, my VR controller is going to be way over here instead of with the animation, right? So with the translate, you're just trying to line it up, the movement of the translate distance with the translate distance of the VR controller, and that's all you're doing there, okay? And then with the roll, it works the same way as before with the YokeManip Rotate. Excuse me, let me go back to the syntax. You have the centroid, right? And then you have the roll minimum angle and the roll maximum angle, right? So you have the center point where the axis is, and you have the min and max. Okay? Interesting that we don't have to put the X, Y, and Z of that axis in there, because I think it's already taking it from these. I'm not 100% sure on that. But for the YokeManip translate, all we need is the minimum distance, the maximum distance of the translate, the centroid for the axis, right? And then the minimum maximum roll angle on the axis. And just like it did before with the YokeManip translate, if I set these inside of the animation, then my VR controller will rotate at half the speed as the animation, or if I put twice the angle in there, then my VR controller will, move well beyond the animation. The animation will be slower than my VR controller. So this is why you want to use as much as possible what's in the animation, at least to start with, so that's the best bet. You're going to tune it to the actual movement of the controller. And I hope this clears up some things from last time. I sometimes struggle with this when I'm doing it myself, and I have to remind myself what I'm actually doing and where to take those values from. I'm also trying to see if I can take some of these values directly from the AC3D, because in theory everything should be in there. In fact, if I take this poly rotate, right, and I highlight that axis and I put on object properties, that's the edit audit properties, which is, let's see if it's right. Let's see. I think it's one of these where it's audit property object property editor. If I turn that on, you actually get the X, Y, and Z for that axis, the center point. So you can actually find it that way as well if you don't want to go into the Cockpit OBJ and look at that. Okay, so that's the YokeManip Translate and the YokeManip Rotate instructions. Those, you're going to come up with all kinds of variants with this as you do this. In fact, I've even seen cases where you have double axes in the same direction because the movement is more of I think it's more of an elliptical in that case, where you have some weird, it's not a perfect circular arc that they're trying to do there, so they have two axes to rotate about. And in that case, you always want to use the rotate that's closest to the actual object. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's where you want. That's the one you want. Okay, if you have multiple rotates in there. Okay. Now, I have the 32-bit version of AC3D. So what I'm gonna talk about now, I can only do in the Cockpit OBJ. It's not too terribly difficult, but if you happen to have the 64-bit version of AC3D, then it's a little bit easier for you to do because it automatically takes the information from the rotate. So let me and thank you Downwardson for the comment there. With a drag rotate, this is sort of a newer manipulator. And if you look at this file, the Laminar Research developer file where you have this, which I left the link in the first session, here's the code for the drag rotate manipulator. It's a new one. It was added in version 1110 along with this detent range. Okay, and what this allows you to do is simply just grab whatever it is rotating about a point in the cockpit, and it just naturally, you can set it to where it just naturally moves the rotation based on wherever your VR controller is. So we're going to go through one because if you recall, in the SR71 we had two guards that were off in some weird tangent drag axis direction. And so I'm going to go into the simulator. I'm going to transfer into VR, and we're just going to quickly look at that. All right, hold on. And this is the last thing that we have to do before we're done with the SR71. It's pretty easy. This is easier to do than the YokeManip Rotates, although it's very similar. And let me go into the cockpit. Let me make sure. Okay, we're in the cockpit now. And let me center here. Okay, if you remember, these two guards over here to the right, if I were to try to grab it, look at what the X, Y, and Z direction is doing there. That drag axis is in the complete wrong direction there. I mean, I would never naturally rotate it like that, right? Moving it side to side like that. And it's not even side to side. There's some like level of X, Y, and Z in that drag axis. It's not even straight up or down or left and right. It's just off and they were both like this. Now I've already taken the liberty to fix the first one here on the left. And look at the difference between this and grabbing it like that. Just grab it, move it the way I want it. Boom, 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 right? It's not a toggle. I can actually still rotate it. A toggle is a switch like this where, you click it on, off, like a trigger. This one, I can just drag it along the animation and it just rotates easily instead of this weird thing here. And we don't like this. We don't like doing these awkward movements with our VR controller. So we're going to fix this last one. I'm going to review what I did on this one, right? And then I'm going to show, well, I'm not going to show you, but I'm going to tell you that, like, in certain cases, let's say I have a case where I have let's say a perfect example would be like a flap a flap up and down where it has detents. Let's say I want it to go along and stop at a certain angle and then give me some feedback in the VR controller. You can do that. So like say at 20 degrees, boom, it gives me a little detent. 30 degrees, it gives me a little detent, you know, whatever. Or maybe 50%, like in the Baron, the flaps are 50% or full. You have a boom, you know, a detent there at the halfway mark. It lets you know you're there. And then you can take it the rest of the way. So you can do that too. Now in this case, I don't have detents, so it's a little easier. But the two instructions I showed you in the website there, if you want detents, you just use them together with the instruction. Okay. So we're going to go back into the Cockpit OBJ, and we'll show you how that's done. Buckling up. Okay, so let me just explain a little bit. Again, you have the case where I have an XYZ of the axis, the point in the axis where I want it to rotate. I'm going to draw the axis in the distance, right? And then it's possible for me to have two data refs on this one. Let's say if I want to do in two different things, let's say if it's a joystick or something, I don't know. If you have two data refs, you have the ability to do that. In this case, I'm only using one data ref. You have basically angle 1, angle 2. The lift is, this is a little hard to explain. It's like if you want it to jump up in your controller, I believe, let's say, then you can put a lift in there, and that gives you some physical feeling. Like, say, so if I say lifting, when the data ref is at V2, lift is always away from the center of rotation and detenting is not desired, then you just ignore it. So since we don't have detenting, I don't have a lift outside of the axis, so it's 0, right, in this particular case. All right, and then I have the data ref minimum, the data ref maximum for the first data ref, and then I put the data ref in there. If I have a second data ref, I can put that in, the min and max of that data ref, and then put the second data ref in. And then I can use the tooltip, which is just a freehand reminder of what I'm doing. Okay, so in this case, I don't have anything particular other than I have a single data ref, a single axis. I don't have any lift or detents. If I had a detent, then I would add the detent instruction after this instruction, and I would specify the angle that I wanted to detent at. So for instance, this is my angle range, let's say between 0 and 90 degrees, let's say, okay, and I wanted it to detent at 45 degrees. Then I would put the start at 0, the end at 45, and then I would put some value on how much I want it to detent. And this is sort of like how much feel you want to have in the VR controller, how much haptic feedback you want. Okay, and I can do as many of those as I want afterwards. Let's say if I want to split that up into 15-degree increments, I would just have to put one for every 15 degrees. So then let's say 0 to 15, the next one would be 15.1 to 30, 30.1 to 45, and so on and so forth until I had the whole detent range that I wanted specified. Okay, in this particular case, I don't need any detents. Okay, so it's a very simple one. And we're going to go to the Cockpit OBJ. These are at the bottom. They're the last two things in there. And once again, you take it from the preceding rotate and then the preceding trans to that. Okay, just like we do with the YokeManip Rotate. Okay. So I've already done the first one here. This is the left cutoff guard, right? Let me just explain. So I hashtagged out the original instruction here, right? And again, this has to be done in the Cockpit OBJ. I don't think you can do this drag rotate in the VR config. There's no, I don't think you can do an action for it. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I just did this one in the Cockpit OBJ. I hashtagged the original instruction out, which is right here, which is the drag axis, which we saw that cockeyed direction. You can see that it's written 0.1 in the X and 0.1 in the Y. That's why it's in that weird diagonal angle, because I have a distance drawn in both the X and the Y. Okay, but I hashtagged that out, and I'm going to put this instruction in, the drag rotate. I'm going to give it a hand cursor. What that means is in 2D, when I hover over that, it's going to change the cursor to look like a hand. Okay. Then I'm going to take the X, Y, Z of the axis, the center point of the axis, which I take. If I go up and I look for the first rotate and then the translate that precedes it, I'm taking it from this. Okay. So X, Y, Z, I just copy it in, X, Y, Z. All right. Then everything else I need is in the rotate. So I just copy the entire thing in, and then I set in the syntax, changing things I don't need to a 0 or none for the data ref, right? Okay, so I have these three. I have the 0 and the 1 and the 0, right? The minimum angle is 0. The maximum angle is negative 46.75 degrees, and I'm following this. This is what I've put in so far, all right? The X, Y, Z, the distance of the X, distance of the Y, the distance of the Z, the minimum angle and the maximum angle, or the start angle and the finish angle, all right, rather, okay? I don't have any lift, so I put 0, all right? The minimum on the data ref, this is a slider, and the slider is, this one is a weapon slider. This is what's specified here in the drag axis, the same one, all right? And the minimum is 0 and 1, so 0 min, max 1. I don't have a second data ref, so my V2 min and V2 max are 0 and 0. My data ref 2 is none, and then my left cutoff guard is my tooltip. I hope that makes sense. If let's see, do these detent commands exist on other planes now? I think they might on some of Joe's, because I think Joe is using this, and this is sort of a newer manipulator, so you might not see it. You might not see it on some of the Laminar Research planes. Let's say I could think of, like, say, one example might be the Cessna 172 has a flap switch that has clearly at least 2 to 3 detent positions for the 10 degree, the 20 degree, and the 40 degree flaps, and you can set a detent to each of those so that you basically you slide the nut, you slide the lever basically into place, and you'll feel a little click in your VR controller when it gets to 10, and then you'll feel a little click again when you get to 20, and then you'll feel a little click at the end. So that's the clearest case I can think of where you have a detent, but you're gonna have to, you know, when you're applying this, you're gonna have to look at, you know, kind of have to know the plane a little bit of what you're doing and see if there's supposed to be a detent there. So I think the flap situation is one of the clearest cut cases where you might have a detent. Okay, most people today are not using the drag rotate because they don't know about it very well, and some people for the flaps are still using the drag axis manipulator for it. So you might want to start using, basically, whenever you have a situation where something is rotating about a point in the cockpit, you could potentially apply the drag rotate to it. Great example is if you have an overhead visor. An overhead visor is sometimes, if you're using drag XY or joystick or some kind of drag axis rotator, it's often very difficult to manipulate that with the VR controller because it's hard to predict in 3D space how that's supposed to be rotating. And sometimes you figure out that the axis you're supposed to use to rotate it is completely different than the one that it's, would naturally use. But if you use a drag axis rotate, all you have to do is grab it somewhere and basically drag the whole object, and it will rotate about its axis that you defined. So pretty cool stuff. Let's see, another case where I've actually used it, one of the first cases where I used this was on the CB with the overhead elevator trim. There's a little lever on the upper right, and that was the first time I wanted to use that. Let's see, I have a question here. The issue you are fixing is because they just use a knob rotate instead of a lift. No, the issue, because you can use a step in a knob too, but what I want to see is, like, if I'm dragging a lever, or if I'm dragging something that has if in the real world it would be I could feel it stopping at some point, although even though the travel goes past that. That's what I'm trying to fix. Okay, so in this particular case, though, in the SR71, what I'm trying to fix is this drag axis hand here, which is drawing the axis in a completely wrong direction for the manipulator. All right, so whereas I'm supposed to be basically flipping that guard up, it actually wants me to drag it to the right and left, and it's in the completely wrong axis. It's probably okay for 2-dimensional, but for 3-dimensional, don't need it. And again, in this case, I don't need to put a detent, and I don't need to put a lift or define those detents in here, because it's just a smooth up or down. Okay, I don't need, it's open or closed. I don't really need to put a detent in there. Okay, so in this case, this is sort of a simple case where I have a drag rotate. And again, because I don't have a lift, my lift is 0. My data ref is going from 0 to 1 along that slider, and this is the data ref for it. And I don't have a second data ref, so it's 0, 0, and none on the data ref 2. Okay? I hope that answered your question. If not, let me know if you're still unclear about that. Okay, so I did the first one. Let's do the second one. So once again, I'm going to hashtag the old one out. Let's see. It needs to wake up a little bit, my computer. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to put ATTR drag, and then, oh wait, manip, sorry. Drag rotate, this one here. Okay. Don't forget to give it a cursor. I'm going to give it a hand, the same one it had before. Okay. And I'm going to find the trans and the rotate instruction. So I'm going to go up, and I'm going to find this trans, rotate, trans. It's always, when you do this, you go to the rotate, and then you go to the trans right above it. So that's this one right here is what I'm going to use for the X, Y, and Z. And again, this is live, so if I do it wrong, we'll know it. Then I'm going to copy the entire rotate in. Keeping in mind that I have a simple case here. All right, and then I'm going to check it against the syntax up here, which I copied in from the page that I was explaining. So I have the X, Y, Z, the distance in the X, the distance in the Y, and the distance in the Z, right? I have the angle from 0 to -49, once again, right? But now I have a lift, which my lift is 0, so I'm putting 0 in. My data ref min and max is 0 to 1. I don't have a data ref 2, so I'm going to put 0 and 0. My data ref 1 is here. Sim weapon Z0. My data ref 2, I don't have one, so I'm just going to put none. And then I'm going to call this the tooltip. Right, cut off, guard. Okay? Is there any questions about that? Yeah, maybe, you know, why you're wondering why stuff is wonky when in VR. Yeah, well, it could be because of a misapplied, or it could be they're applying the wrong manipulator to it, or maybe not the ideal manipulator to it. So if I really recommend, if you're going to get into doing this, that you have these two websites saved in your favorites, and you're gonna end up referring back to them quite a lot, and you're gonna actually you're gonna find all kinds of different manipulators here, and you kind of have to know what you need to apply to what. By the way, never ever use a drag axis pix in 3D. That is purely a two-dimensional manipulator. The pix is sort of like pixels. It drags it over pixels, so you don't need that in 3D. So, but anyway, there's so much information in here, and they're always updating it, to give it new data refs and new manipulators and new animations or whatever. So keep that in your favorites. Same thing with the VR. You're gonna refer to it quite a lot if you're gonna do stuff like this. Okay. So how did I know the proper location of the switch positions? Because it was already tilted left and right cutoff guards. How did I know the position? You mean in the Cockpit OBJ or in the object itself? Because what I did last time is I had the Cockpit OBJ open. Let me go ahead and open it. I'm going to close these examples out because we're done with them. Let me close some of these examples out. Don't need to save it. And finally the joystick. And I'm going to open the file we've been working with, which is the SR71 third revision. Okay, so I'm going to go here, select nothing. And what I did here was I sort of found it in the objects here. So I think it was, where is it? If I rotate it, select nothing, accidentally grab onto things like that. I looked for the right cutoff guard. I think it was right here. So if I go to the object properties, let's see. That's the switch itself. So I think the guard is on top of that. So select none. Yeah, okay, so you see where it says left cutoff guard, and the right cutoff guard should be right here, right? So I looked at the tooltip here, and then I went to the Cockpit OBJ, and I found that those were on the bottom. And also, if you look in the hierarchy here, you can see the object I just grabbed here is at the bottom of the list here, which means it's at the bottom of my Cockpit OBJ. So because of the tooltip, I was very easily able to find it. Plus, with that, I also get the data ref that it's using, right? And so I knew for a fact that this was it, because this was the data ref I was looking for to manipulate. So now I know that I had the manip instruction, and then I had the animation that directly preceded it. And that's what I needed to do this. Okay? So I hope that answers your question. Okay, cool. I'm glad you're liking it. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and actually with this instruction, believe it or not, we're going to be pretty much done with the SR7. This is the last thing I do because as I was saying before, I have the 32-bit version of AC3D, and so I have to do this part of it. Any of the drag rotate manipulators, I have to do manually in the Cockpit OBJ. If you have the 64-bit, then you have actually in the manipulator kind, you have a rotate type manipulator. And the cool thing about that is you put the rotate in, all you got to put in is the data ref and a tooltip. Click off of it, click back onto it, and it automatically pulls the rotation into it. So you don't need to do what I did and copy the numbers. If you have it makes it so much easier if you have the 64-bit. And I was really upset to find out that the 32-bit didn't have it, but oh well, that's on me, I guess. I got the wrong version. All right. So with that, I saved it. We're going to go back into VR and we're going to test to see if this worked. And hopefully it did. Again, this is live. So if I made a syntax mistake of some kind, I don't think I did, but it'll show up. So let's go look at what we did. How about we do that? Okay. I'm going to put on my VR gear. Give me a minute here. Okay, now we are in VR. I'm going to center my head. And then remember, I have to, this is what it was doing before, right? This is what we want, right? This was doing the same thing before I fixed it, but we don't like this because look at how I have to manipulate that. It's like, it's not natural for me at all. So now that I have it saved, I have to reload the aircraft in order to get that to work. So you just go to Developer, reload the current aircraft in ART, and let's see what happens. All right, did it work? Look at that, look at that. Working beautifully. Exactly like I wanted it. I uncover the switch, I can toggle the switch underneath, and I can close it. And it's perfectly natural for me to flip that up and down like I'm doing here. Perfectly natural. I can be quick. So that's it. So, all right, so now I have some time. If you want to see what else we did to make the SR71 compatible with VR, please be sure to check out the first and the second workshop recordings, and because we go into a lot of detail there. We rotated we changed all these manipulators from drags to rotates. We added the middle throttle here. We added the joystick and tuned it like we were explaining at the beginning of this one. We had some trouble with that, so I went over it again in this one. You can see that the VR controller moves perfectly in sync with the joystick. It's perfectly tuned. And we didn't have to touch any of the toggles. The toggles were already good. So let me get out of VR. And I think we will be publishing very soon on the Threshold account. So I'm gonna just package it up and finish it. If you do one of these and you want to post it on Threshold, let me get to Threshold. Okay, the SimVRlabs Threshold. We do ask that you put a specific format in, and so if you want to look at one that I did before, you just note all the stuff that you changed in it, at least give a good synopsis of what you did. You know, if there are any known bugs, you put it in there. If you have an installation instruction, which most of the time is just going to be overwrite your Cockpit OBJ and add the VR config file into the main folder. I don't think there's been a case where we've had to do anything but that, but maybe some cases you only need the VR config, but there you go. Just put this in there, give any acknowledgments to the developer, and again, make sure if you're not doing a Laminar Research plane, which we're doing a Laminar Research plane here, so I didn't bother to ask Laminar Research, but if you are doing Laminar Research, or non-Laminar Research, and you're doing something that is available, particularly if it's a commercially available plane, make sure you get in contact with the developer, let them know you're doing it, and if they have any reason why they, oh, thank you. I worked hard on that. That one was a tough one. It presented a lot of challenges to me that I had to learn. Anyways, get in touch. In this one, remember I talked to Dennis Designs, D-Den on the org. He told me that he had planned to do it himself, but that he didn't have time for it, so he just said, have at it. So I did, and lo and behold, he actually incorporated it into his latest version, so I was pretty honored that he did that. But try to follow, if you're going to post it here, try to follow it, the format that's been set up for posting it. Let us know everything you did. And I think with that, I think we have done everything we need to do, which means I'm going to be posting this in the next couple of days. Do you guys have any questions you want to pose before we close today? We've been at this for about an hour, so it's about in line with the other tutorials and the other workshops. But again, make sure you look at 1 and 2 if you didn't miss. If you only caught 3 today, make sure you go back and look at 1 and 2. You'll see the progression of the SR71 from the very start all the way to the end, and you can learn a lot. And hope that this series has been very beneficial for the community and for those that want to start getting into modding. I mean, even if you don't want to create something from scratch, let's say you want to just tweak something a little bit, then the information post here gives you the power to go into those VR config files and just tweak things how you like it, maybe tune a knob here and there. A lot of times we hear that the developers have put the COM knobs or nav knobs are too sensitive, and if you know how to do this stuff, you can just turn it down. It's very easy to change the sensitivity when you know where to look. So okay, well, thank you for joining Downwind Sim and Skiwa and whoever else was joining. Piper, thank you for joining. Don't forget to join the SimVRlabs Discord server. If you get started on this, you have any questions, there's a support channel in there, and usually either myself, Joe, or somebody else will get back to you if you have a question. Let's see, Skiwa has a question. Only question I have is, do you have any tutorials on editing the geometry of the aircraft? Like the nose is off in VR for the SR71 and would love to fix it. You mean the actual object modeling? You would probably want to do that in Blender. I know that Joe is now working on his first aircraft, and he's posted some pictures of some of the objects he's had to draw on there. So I would say this is specifically for tuning your VR controller to animations and manipulators. This is not really getting into how do I change an existing object. I have, though, in the past added objects, and most of that's been copy and paste from existing objects. So let's say I was missing a knob. I was missing a knob in the Lancer, and I had to copy the knob from somewhere else and then move it and position it in place. And then that was an example where I actually had to change some of the objects that were showing up in the cockpit. And that was because it was an abandoned project by the developer and he didn't finish it. So I had to finish it for him. All right, Skiwa, you have a great day too. We're going to close. And if you have any questions in the future, please be sure to give us a call or let us know on the Discord server, and we will do our best to help you. With that, we'll give a close. We'll cue the music, and we'll close for the day. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.